treat violent criminals, right? On our side, our stance is simple. We give these criminals long sentences and rehabilitation programs during their imprisonment time. However, on the other side, they need to prove the following. First of all, is that how would undergoing the Ludovico technique actually affect the criminals during their existence? And how is this more beneficial when machines basically do all of the work to basically reform the biological minds of these criminals, and how manipulating a person's mind actually does more good than harm than all of these statements that have been previously claimed by proposition. Now let's come straight to the framing. First of all, violent criminals are basically those who commit crimes using force or threat to others, and this is often physically. These crimes are usually categorized by law enforcement or other judicial systems and include things like murder, rape, robbery, or even assault, which are often considered as felonies or carry severe penalties. So how the motion basically works is that, first of all, on the proposition side, they draw this very perfect picture, is that a criminal can exchange years of life in prison for a psychological procedure. The Ludovico technique forces the body to feel extreme nausea when violent thoughts arise. Afterwards, they're basically released with a reduced sentence. While all of this may sound good on the outside, since Prob basically mentioned the following, such as this will reduce the risk of recidivism, basically repeating crimes, or they will always do acts of good deeds and help people around them and re-enter back to society a lot faster. However, Prob is basically misunderstanding a core problem in this debate, because despite the fact that these criminals may retreat and basically never carry out violent acts ever again after the treatment, we do acknowledge this, they may never be their true selves. Their inner selves is still violence in the first place, because basically, instead of steadily wins the race, proposition takes a faster approach and force people to instantly become better. We're basically suppressing their free will. They're not becoming better people. Rather, they turn out the way they were simply because of their inability to choose violence, especially in cases where it might be morally right, like in self-defense. Basically, they are suppressed, and on the inside, maybe they are still violent. So basically, on proposition, they do not fix a problem right from the core. Rather, they're just basically changing their biological thoughts so that they can suppress and not become violent anymore. Before I move on, I'll take that POI. Basically, on our side, we're saying that you should not actually suppress their will. Rather, we are proposing a better alternative, which is imprisonment time and rehabilitation, which will be further implemented in the argument. Because on your side, we just want to make it very clear is that you're not making anyone better in society. You're just creating a society where people cannot be violent because they cannot do it in the first place because of suppressing their will. So first of all, for argument is that number one, we believe that treating violent criminals should focus on their inner mind and ability to retreat and fix their mistake, rather than dependent on some machinery. Because the mechanism here is that effective rehabilitation actually focus on a couple of things. For example, understand their thoughts, teaching how to regulate their emotions, and building better empathy. By then, this creates more accountability when it comes to fixing their mistake. But what does exactly this Ludovico technique does? This basically overrides these processes with pure biological punishment. There's no moral growth, no understanding, and no reflection. It's basically just a conditioned physical response that they are suppressed in. The essence of criminal justice should be about punishing the wrongdoers without messing with their identity and agency to determine right from wrong. The world that basically proposition side is creating is that number one, they are manipulating the offender's thought. They are restricting their free will, and this basically damages their psychological integrity because it basically erases part of their identity and it makes them incapable of choosing between options. rather than re-entering life a lot faster, they are stuck with long-term consequences. For example, nausea, pain, or social isolation because they are stuck with an identity crisis. We do not think that just because they have a bit of violent thought and this then creates nausea, pain straight away is actually beneficial for them. Rather, solving problem right from the core, as we have mentioned, about how imprisonment time or rehabilitation is a lot faster. Sure, proposition might mention a lot of things about how like prison is chaotic and fights, breakout happens a lot of the time, because this is basically simply false. Because when crimes are so violent, there's like when these criminals are so violent and they are taken into these cells, like prison usually divide different cells for different types of crimes, and they're usually crime cells, which will put them in isolation. And there are just basically no statistics or evidence that can back up the fact that fights are unable to solve inside these crime cells. So overall, for our argument, what we're trying to prove here is that number one, the fact that proposition just wants to solve the problem because just want to solve the problem so that these offenders will never create any kinds of violence is simply false, because the fact is that they're basically suppressing and they do not take consideration into these people's minds or even consider the long-term consequences of what will happen. Just a violent thought will create nausea, pain is not the solution that we're aiming for. Rather, criminal justice should be about respecting the offenders in the first place, even though proposition might say they still have a choice, but basically they are still proposing the fact that this Ludovico technique is still the best. So overall, on our side, we just want to prove that treating violent criminals should focus on their inner mind and should be steadily, because we believe that is what the motion is all about. Thank you.